We'll go ahead and get started. We have our distinguished speaker here with us today, Dr. Dan Vasgird. So Dr. Vasgird is the director of the Office of Research Integrity and Compliance, and he's been with us now for about 4 years.
Yeah, 4 years.
And prior to coming here, he was the officer for responsible conduct of research at Columbia University and also at the Central University of New York. And he also was the chair of the IRB of the New York City Health Department. So he's had a very long, distinguished career prior to coming here, and he has presented a lot and published a lot in the area of research integrity and responsible conduct of research. And his overall responsibility as the director, or the program director for this core, is to one, create an environment of research integrity and responsible conduct of research throughout the CTSI, as well as work with our other partner institutions down in Charleston Area Medical Center, WVU campus, as well as the West Virginia School of Osteopathic Medicine, to create seamless processes for IRB and contracts and other such things that are important for the conduct of multi-site studies. So with that introduction, I'll give it over to Dr. Dan Vasgird, and here he is.
Okay, thank you, Suresh. I am compelled to stand here, so we're doing this for posterity. I apologize for being a few minutes late, and I was down doing CTSI work, as a matter of fact. So I just came back from Charleston and Lewisburg and was down there for a few days, and I was fascinated and intrigued by the processes that they had themselves, that they're developing down there. I think it's got a good relationship that we're starting to begin with them, and look forward to our continuing work with them. I'm just going to talk, perhaps not so long and so much in depth today, but I do want to give you a brief overview from hopefully from a functional, also a historical standpoint, on human subjects research, ethics, role of the IRB. I want to start with, this is a basic starting point for me, and that is just to understand, to try to understand what we're dealing with in terms of human research protections. The dilemma, as I've tried to portray, and I drew this from a Word file, is the dilemma relates to imbalance, and what we're trying to address is that imbalance between a very powerful group of interest on one side and a less powerful group on the other. And prior to 1974 and the National Research Act that we'll talk about in a few minutes, there just wasn't any there weren't any processes available for trying to deal with these issues. So when you see the heavier part of the scale here represented, it stands for really the research institutions themselves, the funding agencies, the investigators, and all of the very, very powerful forces or interests that they have, resources that they can marshal on their behalf to be able to maintain their mission, and which is a good one and a very positive one. But on the other side, and at times they have themselves a different interest in mind, are research subjects. They represented here by the lighter weight portion of the scale. And again, as I mentioned, prior to 1974, there really was, there were no interest out there that could protect these individuals. It was done, the protection of human subjects was done on an in-house or on a good faith basis, and researchers were expected to do the right thing, but there was really nothing behind there from a regulatory standpoint that would compel them to do that. We'll talk about some of the historical things that happened leading up to 1974, and again the NRA, and what led to the creation of the present Institutional Review Board system. But just keep something in mind as I emphasize, and as this is trying to underscore here. This particular image is trying to underscore there are no other entities in place that are there for the protection of human subjects. The institutional review boards have themselves a crucial role in the research process. They are supposed to, as a matter of fact, when IRB's as a 10-year plus chair of an IRB and a very high volume IRB in New York City. We were at kind of the crossroads of a lot of very intriguing research coming through New York City, and from all of the major research institutions in New York City. When an IRB comes into a room, and when I would convene it, I would say to them very, very directly, you have to leave your interest at the door. You're supposed to be walking in here and becoming an advocate for these individuals that you are representing here. You're supposed to become that person, but, well, to an extent, you should become that person's advocate, and you should be thinking of that person, and we'll get back to this in a minute, in the same way that you would your mother, father, sister, brother, child. Your advocacy should be that potent, and it should be that wise. That's one of the reasons that the individuals are recruited onto an institutional review board: their fount of knowledge, their wisdom, their experience, and their willingness to be advocates. Related to that is this term from Albert, or this, I've used this a lot all the time. It's one of my favorite quotes. I'm a social psychologist by training, and Albert Schweitzer, and this was drawn from his Nobel Prize, Peace Prize speech. The first step in the evolution of ethics is a sense of solidarity with other human beings. I think this pretty much summarizes, really, and represents what Schweitzer was all about. He was an MD, I think, who found himself in some very, very difficult circumstances in the initial part of his career and decided to make this the mission of his life. But what he came back with is that we cannot, and again to repeat what I was talking about before, become true advocates and true ethical advocates if we don't feel a sense of solidarity with other peoples, a sense of community. So, so important. Now, my office deals with a couple of important areas, and the human research protections. We just received, of course, the IRB is the committee that is based within the within that particular program, and we just received our AHARP, Accreditation Association for Human Research Protection Programs. We just received our reaccreditation it's been about 8 or 9 months ago now, and it's something to be very proud of. I have sat on NIH review committees, and when it comes to the point of trying to deal or trying to understand whether the institution or the investigator has made sure that they have appropriate human research protections in place, if the institution is accredited, it is one of those things that people say, good work, we don't have to spend any time on this, and they give a little check mark, you might say, to the plus column for that particular protocol. So it is something that is a big deal. There's about 5,000 IRBs, 5,000 plus IRBs registered in the United States. About 300 and some odd at last count are accredited. We are one of those institutions, so it is certainly something that is very, very positive for us. The Animal Care and Use Animal Care and Use and Research Office, and the IACUC, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, is based there within the office. Conflict of interest in research. This is a new area of emphasis within the federal government. The federal regs were just revised and rewritten as of August, last August 2012. We have been working very, very hard and to make sure that we are compliant with these. For those of you that have not done a disclosure, just by the nature of being in this room, you would have had to do a disclosure, so please make sure you get yours in. And certainly if you're associated at all with this, with the CTSI grant, this is a must. It is not an option, and a could or a might or a should or a may. So make sure you do your conflict of interest and research disclosure to have it on file. If, heaven forbid, we ever had an audit for cause or even an audit not for cause. They do these spin the wheel things sometimes, and if we ended up being audited here, I am told by the auditors that the conflict of interest is one of the first areas they're going to look at. Institutional biological safety, the IACUC committee, institutional animal, the IBC, the Institutional Biosafety Committee, is based within this particular program. Dr. Vijaya Smith Moter, Smith Moter is our Ryaderg. She just recently changed to her maiden name. She is our biosafety officer, and she is a wealth of knowledge. She comes to us after doing postdocs at University of Michigan, and then more currently she did a 3-year postdoc at NIH, focusing and working just in that, in the biosafety office with one of the with a person that some people consider to be the foremost expert in the country on that area. Export control has been, until just recently, in the last month or two in our office, we're hiring a new export control office, but that office has just been moved, or is being moved over to the tech transfer office. Responsible conduct of research, education, and training, just kind of an example of that is what we're doing here today. We have online courses, but we also do seminars like these around campus and around the university. And that is a mandated requisite and requirement that the feds have these days to make sure that you have yourself a solid and a comprehensive RCR education program. So, going back, human research protections, the IRB, and this holds true for our whole. This is pulled from our policy. Any human subjects research conducted by or under the auspices of any WVU faculty, student, or staff. Notice, faculty, student, or staff, using WVU facilities or data, or accessing WVU staff, patients, or students as participants must be reviewed by the WVU IRB. If individuals are coming here to do research, they still must go through our IRB. We have an exchange system with other universities for collaborative research, for that sort of thing, but we need to make sure that individuals are not taking it upon themselves to decide whether research is necessary to be reviewed or whether it has to be reviewed or not. This is something that is mandated. You must bring it. So don't, if anybody suggests to you, well, I'm sure that this is exempt, or I'm sure that it's not human subjects research because it's from a database that I think doesn't fall under the federal regs, please dissuade that person of that notion. It could very well be that it is NHSR, not human subjects research or exempt or whatever, but that needs to be done. Those decisions need to be done by the IRB office, by our office. So again, please, please, please make sure that you give people guidance and appropriate guidance in that regard. Flexibility, characteristic of our IRBs. We have 2 IRBs, by the way. We have a gold and a blue. They each meet once a month, and that's staggered every couple of weeks, and so that means that we have an IRB. That was added on about 4 or 5 years ago, and that's because of the volume of research we have coming through the university, and to make sure that we don't have ourselves too long a wait for individuals. However, your material needs to be in a week, 10 days, I think it is, or beforehand, before the meeting. The IRB needs to have, if it's full board review, something that is high risk, and all clinical research has to go to full board. then it has to go to the board for review, and early enough so that they can be ready for the meeting when it's coming up. So we ask you to take some time to plan ahead. In other words, when we talk about flexibility, we talk about the board taking things very, very seriously if the gravitas necessitates that. If we have ourselves a high-risk vaccine trial, if it has to do with something related to a very serious STD of some sort, and then that is going to be taken very seriously, and it's going to be given the utmost consideration and by the board. If it's something that's dealing with fruit flavorings or things like that, usually that's going to be treated in a not so rigorous fashion. It probably is going to be exempt for the most part, but the point that I'm trying to make is that it's either that flexibility is that key. There is no need to be concerned and to think that the IRB wants to be rigorous when it is not necessary. For the most part, 80% of our research that comes through the office, maybe 70% that comes through the office is NHSR, which means, and we'll talk about that in a second, or exempt research. The rest of it, expedited and full board, necessitates a board review. Minimal risk studies receive a thorough, quick review. More than minimal risk receive the full board that we were talking about. There's 4 levels of review. The NHSR means that not human subjects research, means it falls out of the parameters of the federal regs. Doesn't mean it's not human subjects research. It could be something that's being done. You could be doing crowd research, for instance, on parades that are being done in downtown Manhattan or elsewhere. And that might fall out of the parameters of the definition of human subjects research. My suggestion always, though, and for things like that, is to run it by the board, run it by the office. I have had numerous times we have had people come to us and say, well, I submitted an article. It was NHSR. I could see clearly it was NHSR, but so I didn't come to the IRB office, and the editor wants to know if I have my IRB memo. Did I go through the IRB? And it could very well be that it could be NHSR or exempt. However, that they still want to see that the decision has been made by the office. So for your own protection, and make sure that you always call the office, even if it's clearly, if it has anything, even if it is clearly exempt or NHSR, please call the office and we will send you a memo that says this has been designated as exempt research under category such and such or NHSR. Then you have it in your files. You don't have to think about it, and if and when. And these days, most editors are going to ask you for a record of your an IRB record. Expedited research means that it has to go to a board member. It still has risk attached to it, and but there are special categories. It's not high risk, and so it can be reviewed by a single IRB member. And that allows it to move quickly through the system. Usually if it's an expedited category, then it is going to be turned over to the reviewer. They'll turn it around in a couple of days, get it back to the individual if they want some changes. Our usual turnaround on expedited reviews is about 8 days from submission to approval. For things like, for exempt research, we're down to about 3 days turnaround, and 3 to 4 days. NHSR are usually done the same day. Our full board protocols, because of the lead times and the like, you need to plan on having about 6 weeks plan for it from your submission to getting your final approval. After going back and forth, an average is about 6 weeks, so please plan ahead with that. The authority of the IRB, requirement to review, approve, disapprove, modify, If we get any kind of word from individuals about changes that must be made or modifications that must be made, then those can be done by the board. Conduct continuing review at any time and in person if desired. Must be done at least once a year. 2, if we get ourselves a report, as I mentioned, then the IRB will usually delegate or designate a member or two, and they will go to wherever the research site is and pay a visit. I don't want to go so far as to say an investigation, because they will just pay a visit to make sure that everything is being handled according to the protocol. They can do this anytime if they wish. It must be done, the continuing reviews must be done at least once per year, but it is not uncommon for the IRB to say, this is really some pretty sensitive research, it's pretty high risk. We want to look at it in 3 months. We want to look at it 4 times this year, because we want to look at the data and see where it's going, see how it's going, where are the risks attached to this. So let us see how it's going in 3 months, in 6 months, 9 months, and that's not uncommon to have that asked for. They observe, they verify changes that are made, they can suspend or terminate approval. That doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. And if an individual, for instance, from the administrative side, just doesn't take things seriously enough, I think is probably a word, or becomes lax in terms of making sure that they keep us informed about changes, modifications, adverse events, things like that. That's the kind of thing that if it's done over and over again, then it can lead to a suspension, and if it's still doesn't, if we still don't find any solution to it, can ultimately end up in a termination. Very, very rarely does a termination happen, though, here or really in most institutions. You really have to go be resistant and to have a termination happen. So what we're asking for, and from from researchers, but also from anyone who is working in this area, is to abide by the dictum of reasonable expectations. I've been doing this now for 21 years, since 1992. I was a researcher, full-time researcher before that, and I probably, in my first 3, 4, 5 years, I called Office of Human Research Protections and FDA, I don't know, probably 100 times a year at least for those first couple of years for particular situations and issues. And I bet you 95% of the time, the essence, and if not the exact words that they came back with, was, what would a reasonable person expect in that particular situation? And that's really the way the whole system works. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but the system that we have in place right now is one that is very, very decentralized. The IRB, believe it or not, is a very decentralized body. And decisions were made when the National Research Act was put into place. Should we have ourselves a tome? Should we do something like create a regulatory mechanism and a regulatory piece that will address all future issues that might arise within human research? Or should we have ourselves something that is expeditious and succinct, but relatively brief, and that we should, and place the onus and the responsibility, the decision-making authority on the IRBs and on the investigators? And at that time, the decision was made, let's keep this brief. Title 45, Part 46 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which is the entity that covers human research protections, is one that is very, very short. It's less than 20 pages. And you can get an idea about how different it is than most federal regulations by looking at HIPAA, for instance. I had a good friend of mine who was a conflict of interest officer at Columbia one time, and we were talking 5 or 6 years ago, and he went ahead and printed HIPAA out for himself double-sided. He said he just wanted to have a paper copy of it. And it was about 2 Manhattan phone books, backwards and forwards. And it was an awesome thing, and I was just blown away by it. And I said, you know, within the human research protection system, it's quite the opposite. The decision, a very, very conscious decision, was made back in 1974. Should we try to do something like this, or should we create a system, very brief, but we decentralize and we say the primary decision-making authority is going to be made where the rubber hits the road, where individuals, where the and the committees that are going to be making these ultimate decisions are supposed to be close to where the research is taking place, both in terms of the community and both in terms of the investigators and the institutions themselves. So that is why it's a very, very succinct and a very short document, and you can refer to it. It gives general guidance. There's some there's an initiative taking place right now, and as a matter of fact, West Virginia University gave an opinion paper out on it last year to change 45, or to modify 45 CFR 46, but as it stands right now, it is a relatively short document, and it gives authority to the IRBs and to the investigators too, to a great extent, and to the institutions under the precept of reasonable expectations. When there is a critical decision to be made, what would a reasonable person expect? And as I counsel our IRBs and IRB members, whenever I'm talking to them or giving any kind of training, what would you want for your son or your daughter in this particular case? Would you want them to be? What kind of protections would you want them to have in place if they were going to participate in this project? And you should be asking yourself that. So what would a reasonable person expect in that situation? So at this time then, empowerment, flexibility, discretion are the kind of the key principles for us. IRBs are empowered, as I said, and they also, we've talked about flexibility, they certainly have great discretion. Whatever happens in that room stays in that room, and that's from all standpoint. And whatever happens in the office stays within the office too, in terms of the decision making. Here are some things that have happened here at WVU that I've brought up in the past, but I want to make sure that I emphasize again here about issues that seem to pop up fairly often for us here at the Health Sciences Center. Make sure that you keep your protocol and your consents up to date. Now this is regarding clinical research, regarding who is involved in the study and the research methodology. If you have a person that leaves the study or is added to the study, notify the IRB with an amendment and update the protocol and the consent to reflect that. It's very quick. An amendment is just a sentence or two on what the change is. You just type it in and send it in. It takes a matter of 5 to 10 seconds usually to get yourself an amendment in, and 99.9% of the time it's going to be approved without any issues involved. But it is up to you to keep these up to date. If a person is consenting a subject, they need to be on the protocol and on the consent form. I can't tell you how often that we have found, not terribly often, but once in a while we have found that when we come in and do a QA visit, we have found that individuals are not on the protocol who should have been on the protocol. Now that's what the purpose of that addendum is, to make sure that you add individuals, or if somebody's leaving. And I understand that these things are very difficult when you have 3-month rotations, for instance, that are happening. A little bit easier when it's 1 year, but for the very short rotations, but it still needs to be done. Another common mistake is to copy the ICF from the file. That happens fairly often. You might have a hard copy file. You might have all of these changes that have been taking place. The study might have been going for a couple of years. You might have an informed consent that was valid 2 years ago. It's been stuck in the paper file. You pull it out, and it has the paper says that it's approved. It seems to be valid. You pull it and you use it for whatever patient or subject that you have coming into the study. That's don't make sure that you don't get into that. Don't make that mistake because that informed consent is invalid. It's probably been updated numerous times, and that's why it's best to pull your informed consents. It's the best thing to do is to pull it off of the electronic file. Other than the signatures also, it negates it if you start writing on the consent. And I know that this is something that happens, especially with residents and the like, and they start making notes in columns. Well, it happens with clinical physicians too, with old timers. But you can't be putting anything like medical data, medical history, contact numbers, those kinds of things. You can't white out anything on an informed consent. These things are things that have happened, so that's why I'm bringing them up here. And also with confidentiality and privacy procedures, separate the consent from the data collection form. Do not put the subject's name on the data collection form. Make sure that you keep those separate. So let's talk a little bit about history past. Why do we have these measures in place? We get a lot of pushback, or sometimes we get ourselves opinions from individuals saying, well, it's not really necessary. Why do we have all of these things, and why can't you just leave us alone to do our research? Well, there have been things. There's a whole range of things that have happened over the last 100 years. So let's go over some of those that have happened over the last half century or so. We're going to talk about Nuremberg in a second. The Milgram obedience experiments was an example. Anybody remember that from their Psych 101 courses? Anybody? You don't remember the Milgram authority experiments? He was a guy at Yale, professor at Yale. Did most of his research in the late 50s, 60s, and it was pretty famous stuff in which he had individuals come in. They were, you would have a subject sit at a board in which they thought was hooked up to a device that would shoot a charge into the subject who was supposed to be in the other room. These would be actors. And they would be asked if the individual didn't respond positive, or didn't respond correctly to a test that they were given, or an answer, they would be asked to give them a shock. And they were supposed to keep turning it up and turning it up. It was supposed to have been a learning experiment. It went all the way to where it got to up to the top degree, and it seemed, and the actors were portraying that when it got up to degree 9 and 10, some of them were passing out, or at least they were acting that, and it was a very real thing that was happening, and the subjects themselves of the study thought that this was happening, and yet they kept turning up the dial, turning up the dial. Milgram was, I guess, had himself family who came out of the Holocaust. He was fascinated with this. Why did this whole nation respond inappropriately? He was fascinated with National Socialism, the Nazi Party, and so he was doing these authority experiments, and the person who was telling these individuals to keep turning up the shock dial was an individual who was middle-aged, tall guy in suit, and had a white lab coat on, and he just kept telling them in a very matter-of-fact way, keep turning it up, turning it up. And they did. For the most part, 60% of the individuals turned it up all the way. Interestingly, 40% got up and said, I don't want to participate anymore, and walked out. But his point was made. I mean, there are situations that you can place individuals in, and authority can be, the impression of authority can be one that's pretty overwhelming. Radiation experiments, we learned a lot about those because of the release of records during the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration, one of the first things that Bill Clinton did in February in 1993 was he released all of the records on a FOIA request for the Atomic Energy Commission. And obviously there was a lot of resistance to that. But it turned out that we were participating in some pretty severe radiation experiments over the years here in the United States. Those became known and had some very distinct. Well, I guess much of it was known even before 1993, but it all came out in the wash in 1993. If you go back and look in 1994, 1995, by the way, you'll see there was a whole range of Pulitzer Prizes that were won based upon the release of that data at the AEC. Willowbrook, talk about that in a second. Wichita jury taping study was just what it says. Some psychologists applied for and were allowed to go into a jury room and to tape jury deliberations taking place after a trial and or during a trial, and then they published those afterwards, and it caused a furor within the legal community in the United States, and editors around, newspaper editors, and a whole range of other people. And since that time, and since the 50s when that happened, jury trials have become sacrosanct. Can't do any research on juries. The Jewish chronic disease cancer study was, and I was talking with someone here about 6 months ago in our department of ophthalmology here at Health Sciences, and a person who was a resident back when this happened. And the study was that they took live cells and supposedly had cancer in them, and then they took individuals who, compromised individuals or individuals who were vulnerable, homeless, and some of those who had themselves mental impairments also, and injected them with live cancer cells with the idea that they were going to induce cancer and to be able to study it afterwards. When this was discovered, it caused an ethical outcry in the United States. But as this is going on, now this is happening in the 60s, going into the 70s, and too. Now these things are starting to happen, and I'm just pulling a few of these here. Over and over and over again, these research scandals are happening. They're starting to really build up over time. The thalidomide tragedy was, people here, probably everybody here is familiar with thalidomide, the issue, but if it's used, and it was used back in the late 50s, going into the early 60s, for pregnant women to reduce the effects of pregnancy, some of the side effects from pregnancy. The problem was that it would cause serious physical impairment to the infants who were born. And why it became an ethical issue here in the United States was that it continued to be used into the early 60s here in the United States after it had been banned in Europe 18 months earlier. So it became a real ethical issue, and one that the public was, well, justifiably very upset about. Syphilis experiments, and this was, we're going to talk about those too, and then Jesse Gelsinger. We'll talk about those in a second, the syphilis experiments at Tuskegee in Guatemala. Any of you have heard of Jesse Gelsinger? This was a relatively recent scandal. It took place about 10 years ago. Jesse was a young man, had himself a genetic ailment. It's most severely affected children when they were very, very young. And he wanted to, but he had gotten over that. He was 19 years of age. He was recruited through a national database. He went to the University of Pennsylvania to participate in this trial that gave hope of having some type of remediation for that particular ailment. When he got there on a Tuesday, and he was dead by Friday, and it turned out that there was, of course, an in-house and also a federal investigation that took place. What they found was a number of things. There were animal studies that were not, that the research or the results were not given to the subjects, in which they precluded really that this research should have even been done, but it was never included in the consent form, and it was never even shown to the IRBs. Was prevented, and it showed there were numbers of animals that died from using the particular treatment. There are a range of other things that happened too with it. A couple of those were, well, conflict of interest issue was the one that became most significant. And Jesse, the Gelsinger case has been like the Tuskegee case in terms of human research protections. It has become the conflict of interest kind of bellwether, or the changing tide, you might say. And the reason for that was the researcher himself had $7 million in stock in the company that was funding the research. It was also funded jointly by NIH. but he stood to gain, to double his holdings up to $14 million if this particular research was successful. Turned out also that the University of Pennsylvania had $3 million in stock in the company, and that was institutional conflict of interest. These things were never told to Jesse or to his family or to other people who participated in the project. It became a an outcry occurred from that. And all of them, to tell you the truth, we can take all of these conflict of interest issues that have piled up in the last, or that are arising in the last 10 years, and they really started with the Gelsinger case. Let me talk a little bit about the Nazi experiments, doubling back, because out of that came some pretty important ethical principles. There are thousands of photos that are online that I could have pulled for here. This was an experiment. I just did this because I had visited Dachau some years ago, and this was this down here are ice blocks. And this individual, who is a prisoner, is being bound and put into this supposedly a protection device. And this was research that was being done to see how long it would take with using one of these flotation but protection devices, suits, and how long it would take for the individual to come to die. Being immersed in this particular cold. They were doing this, they said, because their pilots were going down in the North Sea and they were trying to develop these devices, but they were using the concentration camp members and bringing them to prisoners to death in the process. I'm still stymied when I look through these ranges of photos at times and to see the matter-of-fact looks on the quote-unquote physicians who were doing this research, and as if they're not even looking at another human being. They're just thinking about what the process there. These are some of those individuals that went on trial, part of the Nuremberg trials. Part of the Nuremberg trials were a trial of the physicians that were doing this particular research on human subjects. Out of that came the Nuremberg Code, and the most important of those is the first principle, which is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Prior to 1947, we had nothing that was in writing like this, and it was accepted as a universal code. So all of this is really the last 6 decades or so. It's all relatively new. These principles, these ethical principles that we have for human research protections. In the United States, the Nuremberg Impact, American researchers resisted it. It never was codified. Nuremberg was never codified in the United States. American research thought it never would happen here. Only those bad Nazis were doing this stuff. So there was no one rule there was no rule that someone had to follow the code. But then as these scandals kept piling up and piling up and piling up, and here's another one of those, this public started getting less and less patient and more with the research community. This is one of those, another one of those that that essentially broke the camel's back. This is the Willowbrook State School scandal. Willowbrook, I lived on Staten Island when I lived in New York. The 2 decades that I lived in New York, and this was only about a mile from my home. It's now the College of Staten Island campus. And Willowbrook had been in existence for like 100 years, and it had taken children into its midst, and that were very severely autistic children, severely handicapped. It was just people institutionalized their children there. However, between 1956 and 1963, it was a stipulation that the parents that were allowing their children to be institutionalized there, they had to allow their children to be infected with hepatitis A. So, and only allowed in the school if this happened. And huge outcry, as you can imagine, related to this. In 1966, the Declaration of Helsinki comes out of the World Medical Association meetings in Helsinki, of course. And they have more specific rules. This is about 20 years after Nuremberg, but they said we need something more specific for the kinds of clinical research being done around the world. The American Medical Association is one member of the WMA. So they came out with these more specific rules. It needs to be in writing. The consent form can't just be asking somebody for their consent and stating that they gave their consent based upon a verbal dialogue. Research built on previous work, must have written plan, must be reviewed by an independent IRB. Caution, if the participant is in a dependent relationship with the researcher, that's very directly focused on clinicians who are treating individuals and having mix-ups happen for them. Participants must receive the best proven care, and that has caused some difficulty and consternation here in the United States and throughout the world. The reason for this is, and it's best exemplified by AZT. AZT is used in the treatment of HIV transmission for pregnant women, and it can cut down on that HIV transmission possibility significantly. However, it's very expensive. A pregnant HIV positive mother in the United States receives free AZT treatment, and it cuts down the possibility of that transmission down into 10–15%, from a possibility of around 70 to 80% if the person is untreated. But it's, and I just looked at this a couple of years ago. I haven't seen it most recently, but it's about $4,000 for the treatment. The reason it's become an issue is because places like, there have been developing countries that want to have some possibility of treating individuals or some preventive care in place, and related to HIV. And what am I? Oh, so I've got to wrap it up, huh? Yeah. Okay. Just like that. Okay. Anyway, the long story short, the AZT, it's become an issue because in developing countries they want to use a more a diluted form, you might say, less expensive form of AZT, which would cost less. The United States, you could not do that kind of research because it has to be best proven care here in this country, and that's by law. And so, and it has caused some real ethical issues around the world. Guatemala was an issue that just came out last year. We paid a compensation to President Obama apologized to Guatemala. It turns out that this gentleman right here, Dr. John Cutler, he was the person who kind of moved CDC and along for the Tuskegee trials from the 40s on, but he also did research down in Guatemala, it was found out. And ethically, you could even say it was worse than Tuskegee because he went down there and infected uninfected individuals. Tuskegee was a research project that went on with individuals who were infected with syphilis, and it was withheld, and care was withheld. In Guatemala, they went down and infected individuals and still withheld care. So it was something that even went beyond. National Research Act, I've just told you about that. I'm not going to spend much time here. The Belmont Report, respect, here, and the benefits must be respect. Benefits must outweigh the harms, and justice are the primary issues for the Belmont Report. It must have respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Let's see. I'm not going to go through any of these. These are things that you can look at on your own. I did want to give you a brief introduction, and I should have spent more time on this, on the KC system, which is coming into place, the IRB office, and it's going to be replacing BRAIN. That's all happening right now. The system is fully in place, although it's still it's still having growing pains, let's put it that way. It'll probably take another 3 to 4 months before it's fully implemented. One of the things I want you to understand, though, is that the KC system is a state-of-the-art integrated electronic research administration system. Human research, IRB is just one of the components. We have ourselves 48 schools that are participating in this consortium. It's a nonprofit consortium. All of us are going through the growing pains because I was just giving a talk 2 weeks ago, and I was there with the research compliance officer from Johns Hopkins, who's having this, they're making the same transitions that we are. KC is being implemented there. All of these schools, MIT, Arizona, the whole University of California system is using the same system. So please be patient with it. It's probably going to take another 6 months for us to really have. But when in another year or so, 6 months, a year, we'll look back and we'll be very, very happy. This right here is an integrated system. Researchers love these kinds of things. It means that you will have one-stop shopping for everything that you've ever done in terms of your proposals, budgets, awards, compliance issues. Everything will all be on this integrated system for the researchers. So, takeaway points. Make sure your protocol and your consent is up to date. Don't write on consents other than your name and signature. Reasonable expectations, as I've emphasized already, and better safe than sorry. Contact us if you have any issues. And above all else, strive to do the right thing. Thank you.